All right. Well, Rocky's having a little rest there. You can see him there. I am having some raisin bread, not raisin toast, but raisin bread. Look at all the raisins. Pretty nice, eh? Reminds me of a story that I was told by a friend of mine. Um, I'll tell you this story. Um, in the springtime, I made a video on this channel where I visited Close's General Store up in Levant Station, way up above the village of Lanark, in the back country, near a lake called Dalhousie Lake. Now, I remember when Close's General Store was open. It's now an abandoned building, but I remember it when it was open. It's pretty much just a shell now. But anyway, there is a video on this channel from the spring where I went up there and visited Close's General Store. I remember when Close's General Store was still open. We used to actually picnic down the road from there at a park called Centennial Park on Dalhousie Lake. And Close's General Store was still open at that time. I remember buying a bottle of soda pop in there way back in the early 1970s. Anyway, it's been closed for decades. But I'm going to tell you a story now about Mrs. Close, the lady who ran the store, as it was relayed to me by a friend of mine who was Mrs. Close's niece. Mrs. Close was her aunt, actually. Mrs. Close was kind of a greedy person. She was a bit of a penny pincher, and it wasn't always very honest in her dealings anyway. She was known to cheat kids out of pop bottle money and all kinds of stuff. Not a particularly honest person anyway. But I'll tell you the story. There was a man who was, of course, this was years and years back when the store was still open. There was a man living up there at the lake in a cottage. He was doing some job in the area, and he rented this cottage to stay in. And he was in the store one day talking to Mrs. Close, and he happened to mention how much he missed his mother's raisin bread. And he was talking about how good his mother's raisin bread was and how it was just full of raisins, and how much he really missed it. You know, he hadn't had raisin bread like his mom used to make in many years, and he would just love to have that again. Well, Mrs. Close used to do some baking for money. You know, you could hire her to bake for you if you wanted to. So Mrs. Close, she told him, she said, I could bake that for you. She said, you just bring me the ingredients, and I'll make you however many loaves of raisin bread you want with the ingredients you bring. And, you know, you just pay me when you come and pick them up. So he thought that was great anyway, and the next day he showed up with all the ingredients to make the raisin bread, to make so many loaves that he wanted. And he had brought a great big bag of raisins, because he said he wanted the raisin bread to be just full of raisins like the way his mom used to make it. So Mrs. Close told him to come back in a couple days and he could pick up his loaves and pay her for her baking at that point. So he left. He was all excited. He was going to have some raisin bread just like his mom used to make, you know. He come back in a couple of days, all excited and everything. He paid Mrs. Close, and I don't know how many loaves she baked for him or what it cost him, but he paid her for the loaves, and he took whatever she baked away. Well, a few days after that, the man was back at the store, and he wasn't happy. And he was yelling at Mrs. Close, really ripping a strip off her. And the reason was, well, as he said it, he had one of the loaves in his hand, and he's holding the loaf up in Mrs. Close's face, and he's yelling at her, and he says, "I defy you to find one raisin in any one of these loaves that you baked." It turns out Mrs. Close had kept all the raisins for herself. So, like I say, that was Mrs. Close anyway. But they actually had a farm, her and her husband did. And her husband worked the farm, and she ran the store. The store had gas pumps, and it was like a little general store. And they had a kitchen in the back of the store, and they actually lived upstairs. Upstairs, they had a big sitting room and 2 bedrooms upstairs. That's where they lived. But yeah, anyway, that's the story of Mrs. Close and the raisin bread. We'll talk to you later.